Today's readings are taken from the Sermon on the Mount, and we're reading from Matthew 5, verses 21 to 37, and they deal with murder, adultery, divorce, and making an oath. Murder, from verse 21. You have heard that it is said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. Anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary, who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Next section, adultery. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman with lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And now divorce. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And finally, oaths. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made." But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And here ends our reading from Matthew 5.
So the reading you have just listened to is the reading set for this Sunday, the 6th Sunday of Epiphany. And Epiphany is a sudden or dawning realization, revelation. And with its coming, nothing's the same again. And in the verses you listened to, you would have heard the famous teachings of Jesus that begin, "You've heard that it is said, but I say to you." You've heard that it was said, and then he'd quote a scripture or speak about something that everybody knew, "But I say to you." You've heard that it was said, "Do this and not do that." You have heard it said in the circles at the marketplace, "This is cool, that's not cool. This is acceptable, that's not acceptable. But I say to you," doing simply what you've heard said is not the way with you. For you who are my follower, my apprentice, my disciple, you are not like everyone else. Do you remember the story of James and John after the Mount of Transfiguration? And they sensed that something important was really about to happen. And they came up to Jesus and they said to him, can you do something for us? And he said, tell me what it is. And they said, when you come into your glory, can we sit on your left and your right side? And Jesus said, it's not that way with you. For everyone else, having power, having position, having status is about as important as life gets. But it's not that way with you. And do you remember when Jesus was before Pilate? And Pilate asked him if you were a king. And Jesus obfuscates it, but he doesn't want to answer because he knows that his understanding of what it means to be a king is so different to Pilate's that Pilate would never understand. But eventually he said, yes, he is a king, but not of this world. He said, if I was a king of this world, my followers would have swords in their hands now and be fighting to defend me, but it's not that way with them. They are different from everyone else. And so, friends, I want you just to consider this, that the bottom line, the summary, the end result of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus is saying to you and to me who wish to follow him into his likeness, you are not like everyone else. So then we have the question, and the question goes, how does that look? What does it mean not to be like everyone else? And in the 5th chapter of Matthew, straight after the Beatitudes, he tells us very plainly and very clearly. He says, when you follow me, you are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. The way that salt was used in those days was to prevent things going off, going bad, going sour. You, by your life, will be the salt of the earth, you. And what's more, you will be a light to the world. When people meet you, their epiphany would be, he's not like everyone else. She's not like everyone else. We see in her the light of God's love. She is different. So Jesus gives us an unequivocal answer to what not being like everyone else looks like. And that is, you are the salt of the earth, and you are the light to the world, your world in which you live and work and have your being. And if you're like me, that raises another question. Well, it raises an objection. It raises, who, me? Really? I know this thing about salt of the earth. I know this thing about light to the world, but me? How can it come about that I can really be that? That it's not just a verse in the Bible, something Jesus said, but that I can be in all my relationships, in my work, in my neighborhood, salt of the earth and light to the nations, light to the world. Well, the place to start, I think, when we think about the answer to that, we find Jesus completely addressing that. He fills out the picture in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. And so let's first ask, how does it not happen? When we read and study and seek to emulate Jesus according to the Sermon on the Mount, how does it not happen? It doesn't happen. We're on a hiding to nothing. Let me put it that way. We're on a hiding to nothing when in fact we read the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus saying, if you're going to be a good Christian, you need to do these things. We know we're on a hiding to nothing. Loving our enemies, turning the other cheek, etc., is not the way in which, if we take those as prescriptions of what Jesus is saying we must do, as we are, it's really not possible. As we are, in fact, some of what Jesus is telling us here just seems impossible. And so here's an important point. Here's an important way into the Sermon on the Mount, which has the best chance of transforming you and me into salt and light. And that is that Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't give us prescriptions of what you must do if you're going to be a Christian. What Jesus is doing here, and we'll go through the verses that were read earlier, what Jesus is doing here is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. He's describing what you and I will look like when, by the practice of faith, the exercise of the disciplines, we find our way into living the pattern of the way of heaven. The word pattern can be substituted for spirit. By practice of faith, by exercise of disciplines, we find our way into living the pattern of the way of heaven, or the spirit of the way of heaven, or the energy of the way of heaven. But it's about who we become, because if we simply try to do the things that Jesus is talking about here as we are, it's not going to happen. And you and I already know that because we've tried many times. This is different. Becoming the person who's not like everybody else, becoming salt, becoming light. Jesus will describe what that looks like and set it before us as a challenge. So, if the way to approach Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to go through the verses that Ken read earlier, the way to do it is not to read it as Jesus prescribing what you and I must do as we are. Because as we are, trying to do what he says here, we already know is almost impossible. So we're going to read this as a description of what it looks like when the kingdom of heaven breaks into this world through you and me and establishes the salt and the light of our presence. Okay? Description. Jesus describing here what you and I will look like, what you and I will be doing and what we won't be doing when we're salt to the earth and light to the world. Those first verses, headed in my New International Version of the Bible, murder, it says there, if you commit murder, do not commit murder because you will come under judgment. That's about number 6 in the 10 Commandments. When you've found your way through the practice of faith and the exercise of the disciplines into the pattern of living the kingdom of heaven life, you will not be saying to yourself, well, I'm fine with God. I've never murdered anyone. What Jesus is saying is where you will be in your mind is not there. You will be saying to yourself, and you will be in the mode of behavior that says, I will never call someone raka. Now, we've got our modern day words for this, and there's one very obvious one, but I don't think it's going to be suitable to pronounce it here. But you're what came to your mind, I'll leave that to you. That's raka. Jesus says, if you nurture that anger, if you pamper your anger and let it simmer within you, you're going to be in trouble. It's not murder, but you're not going to be right with God. One thing worse for Jesus, if you have a look at those verses, one thing worse for Jesus is in fact to disparage someone, to be contemptuous, you fool. Jesus says, you're going to hell for that. Going to come back to what that means. So, if you live in the life of heaven, you're not going to think I'm okay with God because I didn't murder. You're going to know that your okayness with God exactly has to do with the way you relate. And therefore, the next few verses, you won't be saying to yourself, I'm a Christian because I go to church. You've heard that said. You and I have said it many times, I'm sure. I'm a Christian because I go to church. In fact, Jesus says when you find your way into the pattern of heaven living, you might not go to church on a given day. Because maybe you'll arrive there and you know, perhaps because of the impact of arriving at church, that there's a relationship in which you're involved that has gone badly. And Jesus says what you will do is that you won't come to worship, you will go and do everything you can to restore health to that relationship, then you'll go to church. Do you notice that for Jesus, your working to bring health into the relationships you have is more important than worship? Don't worship if your relationship is not, if there's a relationship that's not good. The last part of this section about court cases and being taken to court, you and I have heard it said, what everybody passes on, don't go to court unless you've got the best lawyer. Don't go to court unless you've got the best lawyer. The trouble is, of course, the other side are saying the same thing. And the peace that results when we put our lawyers against each other is the kind of peace you find around a stagnant pond with rotting vegetation. There's a smell that's left, and it's not shalom at all. So Jesus says, don't do your best to find a lawyer you can trust. Learn how to create trust between you and your opponent. Create trust. In fact, you know, I've been noticing, as you might have done, that in the lists these days of critical resources, you know, like, and we're very conscious of it at the moment with the Ukraine war, oil, water, natural gas, soil, the critical resources, I see that people are starting to add trust as a critical resource. And because without trust, there's chaos. And so the wisdom of Jesus is, yeah, when you live in the pattern of the kingdom of heaven, what people will see and what they will say he's different or she's different to everybody else is that you don't trust in lawyers, you trust in trust. The next one, adultery. You've heard that it is said, do not commit adultery. Well, when you're the salt of the earth and the light to the world, you won't be saying to yourself, well, I'm okay with God because I've never committed adultery. Jesus says, let me tell you this, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery in your mind and you're going to hell. That's very strong, but I tell you what, it makes sense to me. It does make sense to me because, well, walking through Blue Route Mall, I've learned to apply the 3-second rule. You know the 5-second rule, if something drops on the floor, you can eat it within 5 seconds, our silly little rule. I apply the 3-second rule. I see a gorgeous woman, she turns my stomach, and I say, wow. And I'm allowed wow again, and I'm allowed one more wow, and then, hey, get interested in your shopping. You see, where does appreciation of the woman, and I'm speaking from the male point of view, it's the only one I know really. Where does appreciation for women, sexual energy, procreation, end and lust begin. And that's where I apply the 3-second rule on the basis of what good teachers have taught me in the past. You see, if it's lustful to have 3 wows at this gorgeous thing in the Long Beach Mall, then what we have is a situation where God the Creator and God the Savior are in conflict with each other, and that can't be. God the Creator has made us for procreation, has made us males to notice. And that noticing is not lust. It becomes lust after the 3 seconds in my little rule. Once I go past the 3 seconds, what I do then, I know, and I confess to you, I enter into the theater of my mind. I download pornography, and I'm not just watching pornography, I'm the actor in the pornographic movie, and it goes on in my head, and it becomes pleasurable. That's why I keep going after the 3-second rule. It becomes pleasurable, and eventually, going down the path of gratification of self becomes addictive. And anyone who's had an addict in the family or addict in a close friendship is not surprised that Jesus says, if you lust, it's going to become addictive and you're going to go to hell. Because we know the hell of addiction. We know how when Jesus spoke about hell, he was talking about Gehenna, which was the simmering, smoldering rubbish dump outside Jerusalem. You end up on the rubbish dump of life. That's the hell. Jesus is not concerned so much. He seems singularly unconcerned with heaven and hell after death. It's not that it doesn't exist. What he's concerned with is that we don't end up on the smoldering rubbish heap of life, because we allowed ourselves to go past the 3-second rule. The next one, divorce. Nowadays, Jesus here is saying, answering the question, what are the grounds for divorce? What you and I have heard said, and when we just listen to what we've heard said, we're not going to be different to everyone else, is not discussions about the grounds for divorce, but the grounds for getting married. What you and I have heard, it's best to just live together and not get married. Because if you get married, the chances are these days you're going to have a divorce, and you don't want that. Well, it's a bit like saying, don't ever buy a car, because if you buy a car, the chances of you having an accident are quite high, and you don't want to have that. There's no wisdom in it. There's wisdom in that long-term committed relationship in which I learn how to love anybody, because my spouse has taught me how to love her or him. That's the grounds for marriage. And finally, the oaths, those last verses that Ken read. It's simple. Don't lie. Everybody lies. Yourself and myself included. We slip into telling a lie before we've even thought about it. Don't lie. Let your character develop to the point where you're one of those who doesn't have to say, well, to be honest. Have you noticed how we say that these days? To be honest. It's like, I'm not usually honest, but in this, okay, just for now, I'm going to be honest. And you might think I'm making too much of that. It's just a turn of phrase. I don't think I'm making too much of it. We live in a post-truth world. We live in a world in which Donald Trump can say he won the election by a landslide. It's clearly a lie, and millions believe the lie because in this postmodern world, truth has become completely relative. Your truth, my truth, everyone's truth. If truth is just relative, what is a lie? And so we live in a world in which lying happens almost without our thinking about it. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, and don't try to add anything more, because Jesus puts it very strongly you'll be working with the evil one when you lie. That's what life looks like. That's what your life and mine looks like when we found our way into the pattern of the way of life in heaven. And the way we find our way into that is not by treating the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus says, as you are, do these things and then you'll be a Christian. It's not going to work. We find our way into the pattern of the kingdom of heaven when we practice our faith and we exercise the disciplines of faith. And I'm so glad that Delm's next sermon series, coming up very soon, is going to be focused on the disciplines of spirituality. The practice of those, the exercise of disciplines and the practice of faith transforms us. And you might want to say, yeah, but practicing disciplines, Ephesians says it is by grace that we are saved through faith, not works, lest we boast. Except in that the next verse goes on to say that we are the workmanship of God. There is work going on. It's God working in us, creating us in the image of Jesus to do good works. So the prohibition against works relative to grace is works towards the reward of salvation. That's not on. But the works that flow from us, because now we are not orchestrated by the ego, but by the presence of God in our life, is very different. And I think the two, what distinguishes the two is that when we are, because you might want to say, and I've thought about this quite a lot, is that this notion that in the end, the Sermon on the Mount is saying, you are not like everyone else. That could become a project of the ego very much. Some personality types are very much around, I'm not like anyone else. Look at me, how different I am. Well, that obviously is not the way. When we are, that's the way of being orchestrated by the ego. When we are in Christ, we surrender into being the image of God. And in the image of God, our life can be salt to the earth and light to the world. Not because we're trying to do things, but because of who we've become by the practice of faith and the exercise of the disciplines.